Hello, my name is S.D. Smith. I am the author of the Green Ember series, and I am your humble presenter for this session. And I use the term humble intentionally. You see, I am from the state of West Virginia, perhaps the most looked down upon state in the entire USA. That is, people look down upon us if they even know we exist. Many people do not think we even exist. They say things like, oh, I have a relative in Richmond. That's a different state. There was this thing called the Civil War. Anyway, we're a little bit touchy about it. But you have now seen a West Virginian out in the wild. There has been a spotting of a West Virginian, and you are privileged to see one. But, again, we are very looked down upon. There are many stereotypes spoken about West Virginians. For instance, I heard one, there was a fancy city boy who was walking down the street and he saw a West Virginian, and the West Virginian only had one shoe on. And the city boy said, "Hey, buddy, you lost a shoe." And the guy from West Virginia said, "No, I found one." See, that's such a hurtful stereotype. I'm so hurt and offended by what I just said. Very hurtful to myself. But I grew up in a holler. Have you ever heard of a holler? Okay, a holler is the hollow between two mountains. And it's probably properly pronounced hollow, but we say holler. And I grew up, my dad said that we grew up so far back in the woods that no one lived behind us. So far back in the woods that no one lived behind us. And I thought, as a child, that was true. So I used to spend time imagining just going back behind our house, so far back into the woods, and never finding anyone. It's kind of might explain a little bit of why I like speculative fiction, thinking on such things as such a young child. But I was fascinated by that idea. So I played in those hills, in those hollers as a child, and it was kind of a big canvas for my imagination. And it was a wonderful place to live. I love it. I love where I'm from. But it is kind of a modest place. And I, like many others, didn't read very much as a child. But once I started reading as a late teen, I found Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien. And I was blown away. Such beauty! Such glory! C.S. Lewis said about his friend J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, he said, "Here are beauties which pierce like swords and burn like cold iron. Here is a book which will break your heart." And we love books like this for some reason, right? We love a book that breaks our heart. It's like some kind of a literary Stockholm syndrome or something. But have you ever read something and thought, well, why would anyone write anything after that? I mean, I have felt this way many times. I felt that way certainly about Tolkien, certainly about Lord of the Rings. But there are many other books in my experience. A lot of people ask me as an author, they say, what books inspired you to write? And I can think of some sometimes, kind of, but I can very easily think of books and authors who inspired me not to write because they were so great. They were so incredible. Tolkien's certainly one of them. Can you think of some yourself? Like some that have been like that for you, that you'd read them and you thought, well, surely now literature is canceled from now on. There shall be no more writing henceforth in the world. I definitely felt that way about Tolkien, about when I read Paradise Lost, which I read as an adult, probably in the last 10 years, and I thought, people had the audacity to try to write something after they read Paradise Lost. It just blew me away. I couldn't believe it. I felt that way about The Tale of Two Cities, about The Count of Monte Cristo, about Cry the Beloved Country, and many other books that just moved me so much. And partly there was a voice certainly moving me to say, hey, don't try to write after these people. Good grief. But still I wrote. Still I write. What gall! What arrogance! How does a hick kid from a hick state have the audacity to try to write literature in the world after such an experience? So let me tell you more about myself. I know you're not bored already from the stories of how far the woods go back behind my house. And actually our house was kind of cool. We lived in the basement of a log cabin that my dad was building that was never finished because when I was 12 years old, we moved to South Africa. So I'm an American kid, and I grew up in my teenage years in Africa. So I like to call myself an Afro-Latchin. And my first birthday in South Africa was, I turned 13 the day that Nelson Mandela was released from prison. And so it was a fascinating time to be there. I lived in a culture that had Afrikaans speakers, English speakers, Zulu speakers, and I have a Zulu name and kind of was in that culture very closely. But when we first went there, President Mandela, or Nelson Mandela, was in prison, and when we left, he was the president. So it was an amazing time to be there. But I'm an MK. I'm a missionary kid. My father was a pastor, and it still is a pastor. He's a preacher. And I can remember when he was younger, and I was younger when I was a kid, him saying, I think he was thinking about comparisons on the day. And I'd ask him a question, and he said this to me, and I don't know if it was original with him, but it stuck out to me. He said, son, I can't preach like Billy Graham, but Billy Graham can't preach like me either. So he was kind of a guy who saw his place, who saw where he was, and kind of lived with comparison, but he lived with it in a balanced way. So, how does a poor half African hick kid have the audacity to write after reading such giants as Milton, Tolkien, Austen, and others? How can you? Let's talk about you. Enough about me. Let's talk about you for a little bit. How can you be so bold as to write, create, and to share your work with the world? And I have some advice for you. I have 3 words of advice, actually. It's pretty simple what I want to share with you today. 3 words. Well, I want to recommend a stubborn, modest persistence, and then we'll get to the 3 words in a little bit. But in the book, The War of Art, which I would recommend to anyone who wants to be a writer, probably person who is creative in any way, really good book by Stephen Pressfield. It's about 70% religious nonsense, kind of goofy stuff, but it's worth it. It's worth it going through that kind of religious nonsense to get to the good stuff. But one thing he talks about is these orientations, 2 different orientations. He talks about a hierarchical orientation. You define yourself by your place within the pecking order. How do I rank with others? And you look to others to validate your efforts and your calling. And then he talks about a territorial orientation. You do the work for its own sake. And I think with territory, just to expand on that a little bit, and Jonathan Rogers, the author of The Charlatan's Boy and the Wilder King trilogy, he's a friend of mine. He talks about sort of seeing your own space as like your own yard, your own garden, and you're kind of tilling your own land. So instead of thinking like, oh, I live right next to Disneyland, and oh my goodness, my property is so measly compared with what they've got going on over there, you just think, I've got a garden here, let me tend to this soil. So it is territorial. It's kind of a way of thinking about it. And I like that. I like that orientation. How do we receive the gift that is someone like J.R.R. Tolkien and other masters, and then proceed with our own writing? How do we live with that sort of comparison? How do we have the nerve or the audacity to share? Many of us are introverts, and we kind of already are afraid of everything. And so it's difficult for us to kind of get outside of ourselves and want to share, want to be bold like that. So it can be intimidating to think about these other figures that are so... And we might be perfectionists a little bit, so we have these challenges with sharing our work. I want to share those 3 words I mentioned earlier. The 3 words that I want to give to you, I want you to think about when you're intimidated, are modesty, ingenuity, and hospitality. Modesty, ingenuity, and hospitality. First off, let's start with the word modesty. Modesty. Understand who you are and aren't. Envy has always been a problem for us as humans. It kind of has been from the very beginning. Envy is kind of in our bones. But modern life has sort of turned it into a religion, like a real way of life. We've made politics resounds with envious claims and covetous claims all the time. We've made technology, a lot of it social media, to enable our most envious habits, or sort of nonstop pursuit of envy. And so it's super easy to envy, and it kind of always has been. And part of our worry and fear over not measuring up to our heroes is because we are spending too much time measuring and not enough making. And I would just give you this simple sentence: make more, measure less, or make don't measure. Make more, measure less, or make don't measure. The cliche is that comparison is the thief of joy, and like a lot of other cliches, it works. It works. There was a simple cartoon many years ago called Tooter the Turtle, and my dad grew up with it. And let me tell you what happened with Tooter the Turtle. So he was this turtle, and he would kind of dream of being like a knight or a fighter pilot or something, and he would go and see Mr. Wizard the Lizard, or maybe it was Mr. Lizard the Wizard. Anyway, he was Mr. Wizard. And he would shrink down and go into this little lizard's house, who was a wizard and talked had a German accent. I think that was kind of a thing during this time, and all the sort of scientists sounded like Werner von Braun or somebody, or Einstein. Anyway, he would talk to him. He would say, I want to go on this adventure. I want to be a knight. And so Mr. Wizard would turn him into a knight and send him into the medieval period, and he would go and he would fight. And eventually, of course, Tooter would get into trouble of some kind. He would be surrounded by enemies, and they'd all be attacking him. Or the Red Baron would be bearing down on him as if he was a fighter plane, and he would be falling. He would say, Mr. Wizard, get me out of here! Which actually is quoted in the movie The Matrix, if you've ever seen that. Mr. Wizard, get me out of here. That's how Keanu Reeves says it, but Tooter the Turtle was like, Mr. Wizard, get me out of here! And he didn't have a phone. But Mr. Wizard would bring him back, save him, and he would kind of give him this lesson about, why don't you just kind of be content with who you are? You don't have to be someone else. And he would say, these are the words of Mr. Wizard, he would say, always I tell you, Tooter, be just what you is, not what you is not. Folks what do this have the happiest lot. Always I tell you, Tooter, be just what you is, not what you is not. Folks what do this has the happiest lot. So my dad was influenced by this, I guess, because I heard that about 9,000 times as a kid. I've heard it all the time growing up when there was any kind of a comparison or some kind of envy. And I was a kind of a kid that, was a stargazer and a dreamer, that sort of thing. So I had a lot of longing and that sort of thing. And so I heard that a lot. I heard that a lot from my dad. Always I tell you, be just what you is, not what you is not. Folks what do this have the happiest lot. And that's a very sort of, speaking of West Virginia from going back, that's a very kind of mountain wisdom kind of a thing that came from this German wizard in a last century, early part of last century's cartoon world. But it sort of jives. I think I understand why it jives so much with my dad. It's a very kind of a humble mountain wisdom sort of a thing. So making, not measuring. Being content. Be just what you is, not what you is not. Humility is good. Don't think of yourself as elite. A lot of artists, we tend to think of ourselves as elite, as kind of the cream of the crop, and that's really not a good way to think. Think about yourself as a servant. Storytelling is a service industry, and the arts are especially. It's not helpful for us to think about ourselves as kind of the cream of the crop and elite. You can value what you're doing as a gift and say, I feel good about this. I'm glad. I love the magic of storytelling, while at the same time understanding that it's about service and love more than it is about fame and self-expression. I say this often, but self-expression is barely the beginning of art. It's certainly not the end of it. So don't get hung up on that. Humility is an opportunity to see ourselves as servants and to see ourselves as someone who offers something else. So the posture, the big word for that is modesty. Modesty. And sin sort of spirals in on us. Sin spirals in on us, and love spirals out and lets us see other people. So let's, as artists, as creative people, as storytellers, as musicians, let's follow the way of love, and let's follow it with that word, modesty. That's the first word. So second word, modesty. And again, just the last thing, modesty is an enemy of measuring and an ally to making. Modesty is an enemy of measuring and an ally to making. Our second word is ingenuity. Ingenuity is defined by the American Heritage Dictionary, and Americans, as we all know, invented English. It defines ingenuity as inventive skill or imagination, cleverness, an ingenious or imaginative contrivance. So ingenuity. Entrepreneurs talk about an unfair advantage. So have you ever heard this expression? So you're raised with a junkyard in your backyard and you're able to like work on cars or something, like then you kind of have an unfair advantage in the automotive industry because you sort of grew up around that. That's a way of talking about an unfair advantage. Well, I actually now look at my sort of hillbilly upbringing as not a bug but a feature. I believe it's an advantage. I now look back and see how the Lord used that in my life to sort of shape me as a storyteller. I was world building way before I was world smithing, I think, before I was ever wordsmithing. Back in the day, I was always creating worlds in my mind all the time. So I see it as an advantage. It makes me unique among writers in some ways. So, and again, even thinking back on my own life story, which honestly, to be very frank and not silly at all, has involved a lot of pain. Again, that's something that's crucial to what I'm able to create now. And I now see that again, don't look back on it with fondness or say, oh, I'm so glad for that pain in the sense of like I enjoy that or anything. But now I see it as necessary. I see it as a necessary part of shaping me as a character and someone who can share things with the world that have meaning and have matter. And really, I don't think that too many of us create things that have no pain and that give value to the world, that there's no pain involved. I think there's always kind of a labor before there's a birth. Like there's always a cross before a crown. I think that's true of the arts as well. So, what's true about you that's unique? You have ingenuity. What's true? What do you have to offer? Frederick Buechner said that the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. I think that's pretty swell. You do have unique gifts. You do. And you have a kind of glory about you. You have this sort of ethereal glow around your face. You are a dirtbag. That took a turn real quick, didn't it? But dirtbag is only part one of the story. You are a dirtbag who has, like me, been fashioned by God. The psalmist says that God is an artist who has the work of his fingers is marvelous. And when he formed man from dirt, he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and we became living beings. We are not just capable of being inspired. We are divinely inspired from our inception, from the beginning. Now, like Humpty Dumpty, we have had a great fall, and the king, a terrible fall. But the king is putting us back together again. We are alive with spirit, breath, wind. You might even be able to hear the wind blowing behind me. I hear it. And we are capable of glorious things. Even in our modesty, we are capable of profound beauty and goodness. We are. Like the moon, we reflect the greater light of our God-breathed beginning. And what do we do with that? We subcreate. So get connected. Get connected to your unique gifting and make out of it what you can, even the pain. We, in your audience, don't really need anything else from you. And hold those truths at the same time. The magic and the ordinary at the same time. Hold them at the same time. Modesty and ingenuity. So modesty, ingenuity, and our third word that I think will help us is hospitality. Modesty, ingenuity, and hospitality. As I said earlier, self-expression is not the end of art. It is barely the beginning. You are unique and gifted. You don't even really have to know what your unique gifts are, though you'll probably discover them as you go, I think. But know that you have them, and what makes you is special. It really is. So that's true about ingenuity. But that gift that you have is for something, for someone, for people. It's for a community. You wouldn't make a meal, and I use this example a lot, but you wouldn't make a meal, spend all kinds of time in the kitchen, working hard, cooking things up, searing the meat just right, cooking the vegetables, and making everything just right, and then serve a meal with a cage over top of it. You wouldn't do that, right? You wouldn't do that. You want to give it to people, serve it. Your ingenuity is for something. It's a gift for others. So serve that meal. Love. If you're a writer, love your reader. Welcome them. Give them a gift. It's hospitality. And to say, I can't do it like Tolkien can, who cares? If you have a church, if you're in a church family and you want to have someone over, like, You can't think, oh, I can't do that the way that this other person does in the church who's just really excellent at this. Do it the way you do it. Do it the way you do it. Don't let the comparison rob you from the opportunity of sharing your unique gifts with the world. Have modesty. Understand that you have ingenuity too, but then have the hospitality to share it, to give it. The people in your life don't need hypothetical experts. They need you. And it's the same for your audience, for your readers, for your listeners, for the people who receive your art. So, our 3 words are modesty, ingenuity, and hospitality. Sure, our literary heroes are giants. They are big heroes to us. You aren't Jane Austen, or Madeleine L'Engle, or C.S. Lewis, or J.R.R. Tolkien. You aren't them. But they aren't you. They aren't you. Receive them as a gift. Honor them as examples and guides. But don't worship or bear their weight as a millstone of comparison, condemnation. The world doesn't need another C.S. Lewis. If it did, God would give us one. What has God given us? You, me, us. Trust him. He's good at his job. Tolkien can't write like you. Don't be paralyzed by their greatness. Receive it as a healing balm, but let it heal you for something. Let it heal you for something. Rise up and walk. Go and sin no more.